today's talk is titled The Religious Situation in Arabia Around the Time of the Birth of the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, I might start by noting that we don't know with any certainty when exactly the Prophet Muhammad was born. 570 is a conventional date given in both scholarly and popular literature, but it's a conventional date. It's not based on any exact or precise evidence. So just wanted to note that the talk is based on my research that I did for my book, which is upcoming this December, if all goes according to plan. It will be published by Brill. So we have some 60 minutes here for my talk, and then we have some 45 minutes for Q&A. Of course, I might go over time a little bit. Let's see. Hopefully not. And then at least I'll leave 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. We'll discuss some methods, some sources that we have to discuss pre-Islamic Arabia and the religious groups there, especially concentrate on epigraphy, that is the study of inscriptions, look at Arabic poetry as well, and their importance for historical reconstruction and what can be said on the basis of those sources. And then we'll also discuss through this talk also Arabic historiographical material and sort of the different picture that we get from there. Also, of course, the Arabic historical tradition is very rich, and as we will see, there are some sources that actually align pretty well what we know from this material evidence. The conventional picture, I'll start with that. Of course, you might be familiar with it, but I'm just going to remind you of the conventional picture, then to question it and problematize it, and perhaps we might even say reject it. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we don't know exactly when the Prophet Muhammad was born. This was quite well argued in 1987 by Lawrence Conrad in his article. So 570 is the conventional date, but maybe we should just say that at some point at the latter half of the 6th century Common Era is when he was born. The conventional picture, of course, that we get from a lot of Arabic historical narratives and also popular literature, but also a lot of scholarly literature, is that pre-Islamic Arabia, by and large, was rife with polytheism, specifically idolatry. So people were worshipping idols. They had barbarian habits before Islam, such as burying baby daughters alive. Neither of these and many other aspects of conventional aspects that we have hold true, in my opinion, and I'm going to discuss especially the religious situation in some length here. The Muslim era Arabic historiographical material generally gives this picture of pre-Islamic Arabs as idol worshippers, and that Jews and Christians there were a couple of Jews and Christians perhaps living in pre-Islamic Arabia, but they would have been few and far between. And as you can see from this quotation from Hisham ibn Kalbi, a famous early writer on pre-Islamic Arabia in particular, in his Kitab al-Asnam, the Book of Idols, he endeavors to establish a picture of pre-Islamic Arabia where most or all pre-Islamic Arabs would have been idol worshippers, idolaters. I'm not going to read these quotations in full. You can either read them yourself or look into them later. Or I believe these PowerPoints have been distributed to you beforehand as well. Then, like I mentioned, there are these narratives where this is from Afterlife, his Quranic commentary, Tafsir, where he quotes Ibn Abbas, or at least attributes a tradition, a narrative to Ibn Abbas, where it is claim that pre-Islamic Arabs would have very commonly, on the basis of this narrative, killed their baby daughters. I have a upcoming article in the Journal of International Quranic Studies Association where I problematize or even reject this narrative. There's no material evidence, there's no contemporary evidence of such a habit, and I even discussed the two Quranic passages which are usually quoted or cited as proof for this, as being uncertain in their signification. But enough of that. So that's a conventional picture. Now we discuss what contemporary evidence, material evidence in particular, yields. So I'm going to discuss in particular epigraphic material. So epigraphy is the study of inscriptions. In particular, rock inscriptions are those that have survived from Arabia, both pre-Islamic and Islamic era Arabia, in great quantities. Many of them remain to be recorded and published in scholarly publications, but many of them have already been published, but there are still many treasures to be found, so to speak. Then I'll have a rather brief, I suppose, look into the Qur'an and jahiliyya poetry and pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. Then, if one were to reconstruct pre-Islamic Arabia in the full picture of it and use all the sources, we should also use non-Arabic pre-Islamic texts which we have in Greek and Syriac. So these would be contemporary texts. They're literary texts, so they are not material evidence as such, but can be used for sort of supporting evidence. And then, of course, fourth, we have Islamic era Arabic texts, but like I mentioned, this should be used with considerable amount of caution. The picture, for instance, that one gets from Hisham ibn Kalbi is a very different one to that which one gets from epigraphy in particular. Also the Quran and jahiliyya poetry, I must say. Okay. So those are sort of the main sources that one should use, and I would say that that's sort of like archaeology and epigraphy are the most important ones. They are material evidence, and if they are interpreted in the right way, they are sort of evidence on stone. Whereas, for instance, literary texts have their rhetorical means and such things that have to be taken into account, and also many Syriac and Greek texts, for instance, which are sometimes contemporary evidence, but they were still written in most cases by outsiders who were not living in Arabia. And then Islamic Arabic texts are late material. They are some 200 or 300 years later than the evidence, than the events that they endeavor to portray. So let's have a look into the pre-Islamic Arabia and the different religious groups that we find there on the basis of archaeology. So much of this material that I'm going to present have been have surfaced or found and published by researchers in the 21st century. So much of it is quite recent, very active in Arabia, both in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen have been, for instance, Laila Neme, Ahmed El-Jallad, and Ivona Gaidak, of course, Christopher Robin, for instance, as well. These people, epigraphists and historians, have published very important inscriptional evidence, archaeological evidence from the region. Excuse me. If I start with a sort of broad outline, some general trends that we find in the material evidence, and this is in contrast to what one might think on the basis of Ibn al-Kalbi, for instance, his Kitab al-Asnam that I cited at the beginning. So all of the surviving material evidence from the 5th and 6th centuries from Arabia is Jewish or Christian. Or in some cases, we can say it's some sort of monotheism that we cannot identify, or perhaps the person, him or herself, who wrote the text did not really identify as Jewish or Christian, but it is monotheist nonetheless. There is no finds in material evidence, as far as I know, that would point towards the continuation of polytheism in the 5th and 6th centuries. And like I mentioned, the 6th century is when the Prophet Muhammad was born, and then the latter half of it. So this is the general trend. But before this, until the 4th century Common Era and up to the 4th century Common Era, we have quite a lot of epigraphic material in Sabaik, in the south, hereabouts. Today's Yemen, and also southern parts of Saudi Arabia. And then we have Nabatean evidence, Nabatean inscriptions from the north, and also here modern day Jordan, and Safavidic evidence from modern day Jordan and southern Syria. And these sets of evidence until the 4th century Common Era show polytheistic beliefs, polytheistic views among the people who wrote them. But beyond that, in the 5th and 6th century, we don't have anything. We only have Jewish and Christian and some sort of monotheist texts. The region that is more or less a question mark is the Mecca-Medina region. Mecca being here, this is French map, sorry for that. And Medina or Yathrib being here. So there have been, of course, epigraphic field work carried out in Medina and Mecca, and they're outside of them. But they have mostly been done by Saudi scholars who have been looking for Islamic era evidence, inscriptions that have been written by Muslims. And those have been, of course, published. But the pre-Islamic material, we still don't know what sort of evidence we will find there, if field work is possible in the future. There is one inscription from Taif, which you see here, close to Mecca, which we will discuss, which seems to be pre-Islamic, some sort of monotheistic text, perhaps Christian, but it's undated, so we have to resort to paleography, which is the study of script, to give some estimates of the date. So that's sort of the problem. We just don't know at the moment from Mecca and Medina, but we know from all other parts of to the south and to the north of Medina and Mecca. So I would be very surprised if Mecca and Medina were somehow completely insulated from the general trends in Arabic Peninsula. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of these inscriptional finds that have been published in recent years. Of course, there's quite a few of them, so just a few snapshots suffice here. So start with Judaism and then discuss Christianity. Then, if we have time, we'll also discuss Arabic poetry and the Quran as well, and how well do they align with the picture that I'm presenting here. So this is I would say a Jewish inscription, or inscription written by a Jewish person in 303 Common Era. It was found from the book and published by Laila Neeme in 2018. You have the text here. So just a few words. The script is a late Nabatean script, from which evolves during the next centuries evolves the Arabic script. So it's a direct continuation of the Nabatean script. As regards the language of this particular inscription, it's a mixture of Aramaic. So first 3 lines are, one might say, in Aramaic, and the last 3 ones are, one might say, in Arabic. So, and this is very common in these finds from the northern parts of the peninsula of this day. They are usually in this late Nabatean script, and they are usually a mixture of Aramaic and Arabic. So what is interesting here is that the person says that he wrote Kataba Yawm Hajj al-Fatir. So Hajj al-Fatir, clearly an Arabic Idafa construction there. The day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, a Jewish feast, and then he also gives a date, and these dates are always according to the province of Roman Arabia, which started in 106 Common Era when Rome conquered Nabatea. So that becomes year 1 according to this calendar. Interestingly, also the date is in Arabic. So the person Shulai, son of Aushub, writes it in with giving an Arabic decade and the year is in Arabic. All right. Mia being written here. If you ever wonder why the Arabic Mia is written in such a weird fashion that there's an alif at the middle, it's because it's a direct continuation of the Nabatean writing form, where Hamza is marked by an alif. All right. So in the north, we have evidence of a quite early coming of Judaism there. Then in the south, basically the whole kingdom of Hemyar seems to at some point convert to Judaism. At least the ruling elite converted to Judaism. There's some discussion of the exact identification of the people there. Perhaps there were a lot of people who were some sort of monotheist without necessarily aligning with Judaism completely. But that's another debate, which I'm not going to go into. This is a building inscription mentioning the building of a synagogue called Barig, a famous Himyari synagogue in Ma'rib, the capital of the kingdom at the time. This is from 433. These Sabaik inscriptions, the Himyari inscriptions, they follow another calendar than the one that I just mentioned. But in the south as well, we can say that in the 4th century, we have a lot of evidence of Judaism being the main religion there. We don't have any evidence of any polytheist beliefs anymore. That doesn't, of course, mean that there were no people who still held to older polytheist beliefs, but at least it would seem that the ruling elite and upper middle class, as we might say nowadays, converted to Judaism. I'm just going to jump here once because we are in the south. So also Christianity comes to the south earlier than we thought, actually, because it's been quite often thought that it is only with the Abyssinian invasion, the Ethiopian invasion starting in 510s, that Christianity really spreads in the south. But some 10 years ago, Christian Robin and his team, they found these Arabic inscriptions, old Arabic inscriptions from near Najran, where, according to these inscriptions, it would seem that the Christian community there was was somewhat earlier than we thought. So it's from the late 5th century, actually. This inscription was written by somebody called Thauban Maliku, and then he gives a date, and there's a big cross indicating, in my opinion, quite certainly that he was Christian and wanted to signal Christianity. There were a lot of these inscriptions with crosses that they found there from the Hema region. Somebody called Ishaq, son of Bar, they used the Aramaic Bar here. Omar has also included a cross here, and then we have somebody called, I think, Bar Marthad al-Ilah. So his name is Marthad of God, and then also Muawiyah, Bar al-Harith, and with the cross here. So very interesting texts show that they were Christians living in this region, at least the Najran region, in the 5th century already, before the Ethiopian invasions in the 6th century, and probably those Ethiopian invasions made the Christianity spread even more in the Yemen region, as we know that they sponsored the building of churches, for instance. Note, by the way, on the basis of these inscriptions, that there were apparently people called Omar and Muawiyah, and these very typical Arab names, who were Christian, and which of course later then become Muslim names. So on the basis of names alone, we shouldn't exclude somebody being a Christian or the other way around. And then jumping back and forth a little bit, but I was in the south in the previous slides. Now I'm once again moving to the north. This is from Northwest Arabia, from near Dumatul Jandal, published in 2017 by Laila Neme. New Arabic Christian inscription. Once again, Christianity here is inferred on the basis of a cross that is there. Of course, one could make the claim that that this doesn't, with any certainty, mean that the person was, with complete certainty Christian, but it would seem quite reasonable to me to suppose so. Also, the person uses, instead of Allah, for instance, to refer to God, he uses al-Ilah, which is the most common way for Arabic-speaking Christians of this era to refer to God. So on the basis of al-Ilah and the cross at the end, I would be happy to announce this person as a Christian. We don't know his name. It's very difficult to read, and Laila Neme didn't suggest anything certain. So the inscription that I'm talking of is here. There's some other inscriptions here. An ancient North Arabian inscription, probably much earlier here. And there's some pictures of camels. But this is probably the youngest of the inscriptions and engravings on this stone, and it's the one that is the Christian one, and which I'm discussing here. So it's from the 6th century, and like I mentioned, the personal name is not quite certain, but it's something Bar Salama, the son of Salama, and then there's a date, once again following the Roman province of Arabia. And these sorts of finds, which are multiplying as we speak, like I mentioned, all of them from the 5th and 6th century are Jews or Christian. There are some other, this I already showed. There are some inscriptions, of course, which seem to be monotheists, generally speaking, but which we cannot be certain what sort of identity the person writing wanted to signal. One inscription republished by Ahmed al-Jallad and Haytham Sidki 2 years ago falls into this category. It's an old inscription. It was found, I believe, if I remember correctly, in the mid 20th century by an American team working there at the time. It was published and thought to be an Islamic era inscription. Jallad and Sidki republished it with a new interpretation and with a new picture of the inscription. This is from near Taif, which is a town, of course, near Mecca, not far from it. And it is this one. The new picture that they published in the article is not very good. So unfortunately, it's this one. They also provide a tracing, a new treating. They think they suggest that it reads Barakum Rabbuna Ana Qurra Bar something, Sad, Seed, something. Of course, one could read simply Tarahama Rabbuna Abaqar Qurra. The word Tarahama often requires Allah, but it sometimes is used without Allah in epigraphic material from the Islamic era, so difficult to say. But in any case, what is interesting here is that the script seems to be very old. It has some features that are probably could be very early Islamic or then are pre-Islamic, as suggested by Al-Jallad and Sidki. So their idea is that this is a 6th century inscription, a pre-Islamic inscription, and once again seems to be some sort of monotheist inscription. Probably, I would say, Christian inscription, just because Christianity seems to be more perhaps prevalent in this region than Judaism. But of course, we cannot rule out Judaism either. But this is a somewhat uncertain case because it's an undated inscription. And so on. But a lot of this interesting material is published on Twitter nowadays, on social media. So we will have to wait until they receive a scholarly publication. For instance, this Twitter account, Mohammed93 Athar, is publishing a lot of interesting material that he and other people find in Saudi Arabia. For instance, this inscription mentioning that someone is a Christian Nasrani, but like I said, we will have to wait that these inscriptions that are published in social media are sort of published in a proper form by academic scholars. But there's more to come. I know that, for instance, Laila Neeme is working on publishing new material, some Christian inscriptions there, at least on the basis of photos that I've seen. I don't know what Laila's interpretation will be. And I think Ahmed al-Jallad is also working on some materials as well from Saudi Arabia. I'll have a look at chat at the moment if there's any questions so far. No. All right. So I still have some time, gladly, to discuss Arabic poetry, the pre-Islamic poetical corpus. It has some authenticity issues, to be sure, and for a long time, scholars were somewhat unwilling engage with this material because the source problems were deemed so great, the authenticity issues. The 1920s, Taha Hussein and David Margoliouth suggested that the whole of the Jahili poetical corpus is an Islamic era forgery. But since that idea at least has been abandoned to a large degree, and most scholars nowadays think that there's at least some authentic material. Of course, the question is then what is the authentic material there? In a very helpful study, nice, rather short book, short but very rich. Nikolai Sinai discusses the instances of occurrences of Allah in this poetical corpus. He also suggests some methodological starting points. For instance, he suggests that the collected divans of the poets are probably more authentic or contain more authentic material than then the quotations of the poetical materials that we have in works such as Ibn Hisham or Hisham Ibn al-Kalabi and these sort of authors. And it is true that in many cases the poems cited in these historical texts are not to be found in the divans which survive in manuscript form from the medieval era. But still, regardless what I said, most scholars would think that during the centuries that these poems were transmitted, they were reworked to a degree, and sometimes we can also pinpoint the revisions if we have multiple quotations of the poems, and we can discuss and analyze the different variants in the surviving corpus. Nikolai Sinai, it's an open access book, by the way. If you want to go online and download it, you can do it quite easily. Just Google the title. Sinai's find is, or argument is, and it's a very well argued case, that actually almost all of the poetical corpus is monotheist, or at least henotheist. Henotheist meaning that there's a sort of high god in the divine hierarchy. There's a god that is above others, and this would be this high god is called Allah. So even those authors that seem to be Gentiles, in the sense that they were not Jews or Christians, or at least we don't know, we don't have any evidence to identify them as such. Even those poets, in their poems, the general contents are most of them monotheist. But like I mentioned, identifying anybody on the basis of name, for instance, as being a Christian or non-Christian is difficult. Like I showed a couple of these photos of inscriptions from Najran region. They contain names such as Muawiyah, which we might not perhaps typically view as a Christian name, or Omar. But we also have some surviving lyrics from poets that we know from biographical materials that were Jews or Christian. For instance, the Jewish poet Sama'al Ibn Adia, his divan has survived, especially poet number 2 in his divan is heavy in religious flavor. also contains references to the afterlife. This poem, this particular poem, poem number 2, of course, has been the object of quite a lot of scholarly debate, and many people see at least the end of the poem as being a later forgery. I myself suggest in the book that the beginning is probably authentic in the sense as of all of this corpus is authentic, meaning that it was probably revised during the centuries that it was transmitted to a degree, but it goes back to Samuel himself. Perhaps more difficult case is the Christian poet Adi ibn Zayd, because he is known to have received a lot of fabricated poetry in the Islamic era to his name. But there, in any case, there are poetical verses in his corpus which are refer to Christianity, refer to monotheist beliefs, we might say. But that's probably not very surprising. The most surprising is on the basis of what Sinai says, and also has been argued by Ghassan el-Masri, that even in the case of these Gentile, quote unquote, poets, meaning that we don't know that they were Jews and Christians, even they have a lot of verses in the divans, which they mention Allah, and in general are monotheistic. What is lacking in these Gentile poets, in contrast to Samuel, for instance, is the belief in the afterlife. So that's quite clear, and Sinai's analysis is very good, and also El-Masri is in establishing this. And Sinai notes that even though Allah is being invoked and asked to, for instance, requite somebody's bad deeds, or if the poet himself says that he has done well, he wishes something good from God, all those things are in this life. So the belief in the afterlife does not really surface in these Gentile poets. This is such a belief only is present in the case of Jewish and Christian poets, such as Samuel and Adi. So then the question arises, who were the Quranic Mushrikun? And this is actually the only slide I have on the Quran. Of course, Quran is a very important source for historical reconstruction as well. So who were the Quranic Mushrikun? We know that Quran mentions Mushrikun or associators as a sort of outgroup, as sort of enemies of the Prophet. And this has, of course, been studied in the past by various people, such as William Montgomery Watt, who already suggested that there, on the basis of the Quranic text, that there would have been this idea of Allah being a high God, so a henotheist belief, Allah being a creator God, but the Mushrikun and other kuffar, disbelievers, would not have believed in the afterlife, and they would have associated some supernatural agents to God in a way that was not deemed acceptable by the Quran or by the Prophet. So Patricia Krone's suggestion is that the Quranic Mushrikuns are, in one word, henotheists, who did not believe in the afterlife, and who held to some pagan practices, such as sacrifice on cool stones. So this is on the basis of the Quran and Krone's reading of the Quran. And this all aligns pretty well with, I would say, with the archaeological material, the material remains that we have, the epigraphic material, also the poetical corpus. And Sinai, of course, compares Krone's interpretation of the Quranic material to the jahiliyya poetry, and says that they support each other, basically. Interestingly, and I've only mentioned Islamic era Arabic historiography here at the beginning. Now I'll come back to it. I only mentioned some aspects of it. So I mentioned that there are this idea very much present in the literature that the pre-Islamic Arabs, on the eve of Islam also, not only earlier, but on the eve of Islam, they were polytheists, they were idolaters, and they had these barbarian habits. But Arabic literature is a very rich tradition. We have millions of pages written in Arabic, already probably the year 1000 Common Era, and some of the material is historical and addresses pre-Islamic Arabia, or discusses it, let's put it that way. One of that actually gives a very different picture is Ibn Wadih al-Yaqubi in his History of Tarikh. He first has this very long narrative of tens of pages where he lists different idols of the Arabs, and sort of follows the Ibn Kalbi tradition of writing, where Arabs are portrayed as polytheists first and foremost. But then at the end of his long section, which is he changes tune completely, and actually notes that after that, so in some point after Arabs were on his account polytheists, many of them converted to Judaism and Christianity. And al-Yaqubi mentions that Yemen in its entirety was Jewish. This is actually interesting, the idea that Yemen was part of the Arab nation. This has been sort of deconstructed, criticized quite a lot by Peter Webb, who notes that Arab, in his book Imagining the Arabs, Peter Webb notes that actually the Yemenites, until the Islamic era, did not, for the most part, identify as Arabs. They mention Arabs in their inscriptions, but they are always people living in somewhere in the north of the kingdom. So they themselves did not feel like they belonged to the Arab ethnos or nation before Islam. It is only with Islam that people in Yemen started to identify as Arab, or they were identified at least by non-Yemenis as Arab. So, according to al-Yaqubi, Yemen in its entirety was Jewish, and of course this aligns quite well with what we know from epigraphic material, though we shouldn't say that Yemen in its entirety was Jewish. There was surely a heavy Christian presence there as well, like the inscriptions that I showed from near Najran, quite clearly evidence. And also, of course, we know from literary works in Syriac and Greek that especially during the Ethiopian era in the first half of the 6th century, Christianity probably spread in Yemen. But in any case, continuing with al-Yaqubi, he says that Banu Quraydan, Banu Nadir, the famous Jewish tribes living in Medina and nearby regions were Jewish. Of course, that's not big news. They are in all historical materials identified as Jews, of course. But then, more interestingly, Yaqubi mentions that some of Aus and Khazraj and Ghassan and Judah were also Jews. It's difficult to say which Ghassan he means. There were a couple of different tribes called Ghassan. The one that is more famous, the political dynasty of Ghassan, was most definitely Christian, so not Jewish, but Al-Yaqubi just mentions it. But more interestingly, of course, is the mention of Aus and Khazraj, the famous Ansari tribes that later become known as the Ansar. And in fact, if you look into the so-called Constitution of Medina, in the other version of it, the one by Abu Baid, cited in his Kitab al-Amwal, there is definitely Banu Khazraj mentioned as having a Jewish component in the tribe. The version in Ibn Hisham doesn't mention Khazraj, so it's difficult to say what the text said. But in my reading, at least, Abu Baid's version of the Constitution of Medina, the Sahifa document, has some superior readings to the version in Ibn Hisham. So maybe these two, in these two, we should prefer Abu Baid's version. And then Al-Yaqubi mentions famous Christian tribes, Taghlib, Tayyi, which we know from other sources as well, where Christian, Ghassam and Lakh were Christian. The Lakhmid dynasty, who held sway in Al-Hira, is of course a quite difficult case to discuss, because in many sources it is stated that they converted very early on to Christianity, but in other sources they are portrayed as being polytheist very, very late. So it's difficult to say, but at least one might probably say that, and this has been also quite well established by Isabel Toral Niehoff in her studies, that in Al-Hira, inside the Lakhmid dynasty, where they had some political power, there were a number of imported Christian groups. And interestingly, Al-Yaqubi also mentions that some of Tamim and Quraysh were Christian. Of Quraysh, he only gives two names, Warqa ibn Nawfal, of course, being one, the most obvious example of a pre-Islamic Christian Qurashi member. But Al-Yaqubi's formulation makes one think that, he at least had in mind that maybe other members of Quraysh as well were Christian, and that would be, to me, even though we don't have any evidence, and Al-Yaqubi is very late, and like I said, all of the Islamic and Arabic historical tradition should be used with considerable caution. So this is no evidence, but I will have to see what the epigraphic finds will yield. But I would be very surprised if the Mecca area also would not have had a Christian presence. All right. So what does all of this mean from early Islam and the life of the Prophet Muhammad? Perhaps not much, but at least, like I mentioned, all regions where fieldwork has been possible so far attest to the spread of Judaism and Christianity on the eve of Islam. And this is also supported by other types of evidence, at least other types of evidence such as jahiliyya poetry can be interpreted in that way, and the Quran as well. So and I didn't even mention this, but of course the Quran is in continuing dialogue with the Jews and Christians. The Ahlul Kitab, as they are sometimes grouped together, sometimes they call Banu Israel, sometimes they called Yahud and Wanasara as separate categories. But in any way, the Quran is in constant dialogue, starting from the Meccan layers to the late Medina layers with both Judaism and Christianity. So the Quran itself supposes, I would say, Jewish and Christian presence in the immediate audience of the Quran, not only somewhere in Khaybar or somewhere outside of Mecca or Medina, but in the immediate audience of the Quran. And this is interesting because the Medinese layer, of course, of the Quran is in constant dialogue with Christianity as well, Christians, but we don't have any other types of evidence of Christians in Medina proper. For instance, the so-called Constitution of Medina only mentions Jews as living there. Of course, it's only one document. There might have been other documents, authentic documents, which have then been lost, but it's difficult to say why Medina seems to be, on the basis of other types of evidence, seems to be devoid of Christians, even though on the basis of the Quran you would think that they were there in the immediate audience. But we will have to see, and I'm happy to revise my interpretations of the religious groups of Arabia on the eve of Islam if new evidence surfaces, which points to presence, either low presence or more common presence of continuing polytheist beliefs in Mecca or Medina or other parts of Arabian Peninsula. So I would say that on the basis of the material evidence, Islam and the career of the Prophet Muhammad was not a dramatic break or such a dramatic break from any sort of pagan polytheist idolatry to monotheism. It's a continuation of the slow but steady spread of forms of monotheism in Arabia. This spread of forms of monotheism in Arabia started already in the early centuries, Common Era. The earliest, I didn't mention the earliest Jewish inscriptions from the peninsula, but they are from the 1st century BCE, if I remember correctly. And from the 1st century CE, we definitely have some Nabatean inscriptions which point towards some Jews at least being present. And in the south, in Yemen, this is something that starts in the 4th century Common Era, probably not before. So in the 4th century, people started to convert to Judaism and Christianity. So Jane says that Islam brought were more piecemeal than conventionally thought. The majority of Arabians were probably Jewish or Christian at the time. Of course, we don't have any quantitative data. It's impossible to get any, as with many historical periods, and we will never get it. But at least at the moment, there's no evidence whatsoever of anybody else than Jews or Christians in the peninsula. So I would be very surprised if the majority of Arabians still were pagans. Interestingly too, and this is something I won't discuss here, but we'll discuss in my book to some degree, actually the Jews and Christians continue to live in Arabia for centuries. Ibn Hisham, for instance, ends his book or is toward the end of the book, there's still some poetry from Hassan ibn Thabit that is being quoted, but he mentioned that the last words of the Prophet Muhammad on his deathbed were something like, let there be no two religions in Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula. This hadith is, of course, quoted in numerous sources, but I would claim that is quite much later pious forgery. We can see on the basis of various types of evidence, including archaeology and epigraphy and literary sources, that there were Jews and Christians living in Arabian Peninsula up to the year 1000 or thereabouts. And of course, in Yemen there has been a Jewish group, Jewish community up to the present day. But this is where I end. Thank you very much for your attention. And